Our world needs you. Dean Ilian Mihov, Dean Erspire, leaders from the city of Fontainebleau, INSEAD faculty, staff of INSEAD, alumni, family and friends who are gathered here today, invited guests, and very most importantly, graduating class of December 2018, good afternoon. It's a privilege for me to deliver this year's graduation speech at Fontainebleau, and I'd like to personally thank Dean Mihov for this honor. Thank you very much. Being here today brings back wonderful memories for me. It was a glorious day on the 7th of July 2005, which is fresh in my mind, on which I graduated from INSEAD. And feeling that feeling again, the only thing I can say to you is, congratulations, class of December 2018, you made it. As I excitedly prepared for today, I cast my mind back to my INSEAD experience. What did I really do here in that year? I recall arriving at INSEAD on the 20th of August 2004. I know for some of you that sounds really ancient, so forgive me. I arrived with a few suitcases, with my 5-month-old baby, my mother. My husband joined us a couple of days later to support us settling in and making sure that everything was okay, but then he had to go back to London. Such was my arrival. It took a whole army to get me here because I needed my child by my side. And one of the things I've discovered in life is that sometimes it does take an army of a support system to keep us going. I came to INSEAD for a very specific reason. You see, as a teenager, I had experienced what was a very difficult decade in Ghana's history in the 1980s. And it was in that time that I became convinced that business had a role to play in creating sustainable prosperity, because it looked to me like the politicians weren't doing a very good job of it. But I didn't know how business could play that role. I was just convinced that that was the case. And so after many years building my career and working as an engineer, I realized that ultimately I needed an MBA. Very specifically to teach me how to run business end to end. That was my goal. I looked around, and given my global and very varied outlook on life and on the world in general, there was only one place for me, and it was called INSEAD. And so I ended up applying only to INSEAD because I was fortunate to get in when I applied. And when you find what you're looking for, you don't really bother looking elsewhere because there's nowhere else like it. I say that with a smile because INSEAD is finite. INSEAD is a great business school, but unfortunately, only a few people will have the privilege to experience what you and I have experienced. And so we should never, ever take our participation at INSEAD for granted. So now you've heard why I came here, but what happened while I was here? I am sure we could share notes. This afternoon in talking to some of you, I realized that a few things have changed. Like, we didn't have iPhones and Snapchat at the time. We didn't even have WhatsApp. But there are some things that are the same. The groups. Cast your mind back to when you first got here and you were placed with a group. I was in a very diverse group. There was a Belgian who was never to be confused with being French. Didn't allow that. A Korean, a Turk, a Swiss-German guy with a Spanish name, and me. This is only INSEAD. Only INSEAD could possibly put together this kind of a group. And for the most part, we were a great collective. But there's always one or two where sometimes you have issues with. And that same person who you may have issues with sometimes in P1, INSEAD somehow ensures that you're in the same group with in P2. And, it's only after the fact that you realize that that little essay you wrote kind of gave the game away, I suppose, in terms of explaining what's been going on. So I ended up spending 4 months with a particularly challenging individual. And at the time, it felt tough. In fact, sometimes it was quite frustrating. I recall once shedding tears over this experience. And yet today I can smile about it because I'm truly thankful for it. I believe we both grew through it, and it left me much more prepared for what was to be a challenging business world out there. Because not everyone's going to see eye to eye with you from day one, and you need to have the strength and the tenacity and the confidence to bring your A game to the table every single time and to earn your place. It's definitely contributed to growing my career. You know, I sometimes wonder how long it took me to realize that every single class at INSEAD is laced with strategy. I have a feeling it dawned on me in Kevin Kaiser's corporate finance class, and I know Kevin doesn't teach here any longer. You know, I wondered why I joined his corporate finance class because it was supposed to be a very challenging class, and the last thing I needed was an extra stretch. I already had a baby in tow, which made my experience a little more challenging. But maybe the stretch was why I did it. I don't know. But it turned out to be one of the most valuable classes I ever took at INSEAD. And I was telling a couple of people this afternoon that when I was at INSEAD, believe it or not, in this class, we actually did a case that was Microsoft versus Apple, and the decision was, you know, this pile of junk called Apple, how much will we get rid of it for? And consider that only 13 short years later, it's one of the most valuable companies on the face of the planet. Makes me think, well, thank God we didn't sell it off. Every INSEADer is a strategist. It comes in many guises, but in every single class, we are reminded and we are taught how to strategize. It's what we are, it's how we think, and it's what we do. And then there was another very instrumental professor at INSEAD. I can't speak about my experience without mentioning Erin Anderson. She taught me gaining market access, a class that would later prove pivotal because I went on to develop sales and marketing models in telecommunications, and gaining market access was very important to me in that time. She was an exemplary intellectual woman. She balanced her life so wonderfully with humility, grace, and patience. Just by being, she taught us a lot about how to be as leaders. And I was pleased that Erin took particular interest in me. I loved her class, but I was really baffled by the relevance and significance of her class for my future. One day I said to her, you know, Erin, I really want to go back and work in Africa, and I really don't see how all this marketing and branding stuff is going to be any use to me. I need you to give me a reason for this, because I can't just go with heart and passion and what I like. She sat me down, and she told me about the evolution of business and marketing thinking, particularly from a US point of view. And then she told me something that I find even more true today than when she told me on this campus. She said to me that Africa was the most mismanaged brand on the face of this planet. That actually there hadn't been a very clear marketing strategy in her view, and it's a brand that had been thrown around. Did I fully understand what she meant at the time? Not quite. But today I fully understand what she meant, and as a business leader, it calls on me with the responsibility to help manage that brand. After INSEAD, it didn't end there. Erin went on to send me a Christmas card. And she also sent me a signed copy of the latest edition of her book, Gaining Market Access, which is still on my bookshelf today. And I must say, losing her is a deep loss to the academic and business communities of this world, and most importantly, to her family. You see, life is ultimately about human connection. Bruce Kogott taught me corporate governance at INSEAD, and he remains in my corner to this day. Even to this year, he said to me, can we meet for Christmas at some point? And it was in his class that we discussed the case of the mining industry in South Africa. And the pivotal question we had to answer was, should the mining company take responsibility for the fact that some of their practices with their workers, whereby the workers had to live in dormitories, had created a situation where it kind of engendered and supported a lifestyle that promoted the contraction and spread of HIV. And I won't go into the ins and outs of what we discussed as a class, but my question to you would be, how will you, as business leaders in a world that needs to progress together, what would you decide? How would you make those decisions if you were faced with that situation? Would you decide what they decided at the time, or would you decide differently? And so 13 years ago, I left INSEAD with a completely different lens through which I view the world. And over the years, that lens has sharpened in focus. INSEAD heightened my sense of responsibility. So if there's nothing else you remember from my speech today, please remember that you're stepping into a new world. It will look new in part because you have a greater responsibility to it. And it is that responsibility I want you to remember. I left INSEAD excited that I had secured a consulting job, and I'm sure some of you are in that position too. We all leave thinking that our continued success is tied to our immediate new role. Don't get me wrong, it matters. But our choices and decisions matter even more. Soon after leaving INSEAD, I realized that I was due to have my second son. So the question was, what do I do as a young mother with a toddler about to have a new baby? The law says that the company can't renege on their offer because of my new status. But what is best for me? I reflected on the requirements of this new job. There'd be travel, I was told. I would have to work very long hours, understandable. But for me, I wondered, how would my colleagues feel about the new woman who arrived pregnant? What would the implications be for my family? I decided not to go through with the role. And in as much as that sounds like a woman's dilemma, I think that throughout life, you'll be faced with times when you have to decide what balance you want to strike between family and work, whether you're male or female. And of course, I was fortunate at the time to have the support of my husband. But don't get me wrong, I was professionally gutted that I did not walk out of INSEAD straight into this wonderful new role. So in that time, I decided to volunteer because I still believed that I had skills that were useful to the world. I volunteered with a startup that was fundraising for a tech park. And interestingly, that startup ended up being my very first experience in having to speak to a large group of people publicly. I'd argue that I've come a long way since then. The second thing I want you to remember is that if you're fortunate enough to already know which role you're going to, then enjoy the ride. But if you haven't got a role, remember that you need to be kind to yourself. You're an INSEADer. INSEAD is a valuable calling card. It will pay off for decades to come. And so whatever happens from today, it'll all work out right in the end. I really pray that your personal needs will very soon fade, because when we talk about job, it sounds very personal. And I pray that as those needs fade into the background because they have been met, you'll be able to wield your power to positively impact the world. Never has our world needed more astute leadership. And by astute, I'm not just referring to your undeniable intellect. That's partly how you got here in the first place. But our world needs you to astutely demonstrate empathy for your fellow human being as you make decisions as a business leader. That you will use your positions and your privilege to positively drive progress wherever you find yourself in the world. You see, despite what you may read, our world is not progressing quickly enough on critical issues of economic equity, environmental protection, and the assurance of peace for all into our future, to name a few areas. It's as though for all our smarts, We cannot accept each other as worthy of the basics of human life around the globe. The excess of a few sometimes comes at the expense of many. I think this is fairly unacceptable. And yes, our technology is booming, but we are leaving too many behind on every single continent. There are many reasons for slow progress, but perhaps to me the most important is that we do not have enough of a critical mass of decision makers who care about these things. Of course, there's a superstar leader with hubris, who in my opinion does not really count as a leader. And he has become to dominate our airwaves, causing many of us to lose sight of what it truly means to lead. We forget that when these leaders are faced with tough calls or they're faced with tough situations, they just shrug their shoulders and say, "It wasn't me." Leadership shines or wanes when faced with true adversity. And until you faced adversity, it's very hard to call yourself truly a leader. So please participate in ethical leadership. It's our imperative. Choose your leadership deliberately. But it's your graduation day. My graduation day was a joyous occasion. I'm sure yours is too. But it was also a day of anxiety. 7/7/2005 was also the day of the London bombings. And as we sat here and we tried to celebrate, there were people in London who were anxious. And I wish we lived in a world where that experience of anxiety is not the case today. But we continue to have people for whom that sort of anxiety is a daily reality. That's why I say our world needs you. Our world needs you to commit to change. Our world needs you and your belief in better. Our world needs you to create new visions of the future, that imagined reality that Ilian spoke about. What's your new vision of our world? Our world needs your commitment to action that creates a new future. Don't get me wrong, we have many managers, we have many innovators. But management and innovation are no longer enough. They're just a great starting point. More than anything else, our world needs you to lead for good. Thank you very much.